quite a while on what's gonna transpire, and we won't really get to it tonight. It'll be next Sunday. But really talking about this idea of the Great Tribulation, and we kind of talked a few Sundays ago about what our views of what the tribulation was and the rapture of the church and all that. So we're going to get into some territory that it's not that uplifting, right? This is the revelation that we think of so often, and let me swing that point back around. This is what happens to those that do not know Jesus Christ. And for us as Christians, this should be the urgency. I can't stress this enough, and I'll probably have to preface all of these with this, because there's going to come a point where God is going to say no more. And that's what's scary, and that's what's sad. And so we want to make sure that our loved ones and our friends and our family and everybody that we can get the gospel to, we get the gospel to. And at that point, they freely get to choose. But up to that point, it's on us. So I just say that because, again, we're going to start getting it. Tonight we're going to talk about the four horsemen of the apocalypse, right? We hear so much about this, and what does this mean, and who are these people? But this is the beginning stages of this. And I'm not going to try to ruin the surprise for you, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you that the theme throughout this tribulation period is that God gives opportunities for people to repent, and they don't. There's not a single person that turns. As a matter of fact, the more that God releases things, the madder they get at God. And so it's sad and scary. And I don't know how to read that. I don't know. I'll be honest with you. I don't know to tell you if that means that nobody will. I don't know. I don't know how to interpret that section of it, but just prepare yourself. Prepare yourself, because this is what we think of when we think of Revelation, and it's going to get started tonight. Okay, so we're going to be in chapter 6. Remember chapter 4 and chapter 5. Well, I've got it up here. Let's go ahead. So, just a quick review where we're at. Chapter 1 was John's vision of what Jesus Christ looks like. Chapters 2 and 3, this is what the church should be and what the church should not be. So that was chapters 2 and 3. Chapter 4 answered the question, who controls history? Who's in control of history? And we know what the answer was. And then last week we looked at chapter 5, who's going to execute God's plan in history? And we saw that John wept because no angel, no human was able to do this. But one of the angels said, stop weeping, stop crying, because there is one, and that's the Lamb. He is worthy to open the scrolls to start this. So that will take place. So tonight, we're going to see what happens when the seals begin to open. Now, I think we're going to stop. I was putting this together, and I got basically about 16 slides on just the first few seals. So I stopped there for tonight. So we're gonna see what happens when the seals are opened, and what will take place. But before we begin, this is the judgment section on God. This is Him rectifying the wrongs with Israel and the Hebrews and getting that part straightened out, and then the judgment of the Gentiles on the rejection of Christ. And so when we get to about the seventh seal, we won't get to that tonight. That'll be next week. But when we get to the seventh seal, this is where what we call the Great Tribulation will take place. So somewhere in between there is where we're going to see the rapture of the church come up, and then the Great Tribulation start. And two things that we're going to notice through the whole judgment section is that there's going to be massive martyrdom due to God's wrath being poured out. And you're going to see not through the seals tonight and next week, but when we get to the trumpets and then especially into the bowls of God's wrath, we will see things that will mirror Exodus, the plagues that happened in Exodus. So, but before we begin, we need to just do a short overview of what the seals represent and what all this was happening. So let's just take a couple slides and talk about this. So really there's three types, and sometimes it's easier just to take this in chronological order. So the first thing is going to be the seals. So Jesus is going to open the seals, and when the first seal is open, the process will then begin. Now, there's some speculation when we get to the trumpets and to the bowls on how quick this will be, if this will be an instant or how fast this will be. And we'll kind of talk about that when we get there. But for tonight's purpose, this opening of these first four seals with the four horsemen, if you will, the apocalypse, this takes some time. And this is why some people think we're living in this right now. And so as we talk about that, it'll sound like a lot of the stuff that's happening. But anyway, but the first six seals, this is called partial judgment, meaning that only part of the world and part of the people will be destroyed. And so this is where a quarter, we will read that here shortly, that a quarter of the population of the earth is destroyed. Then he's going to move to the trumpets, which will be the second. So when the seventh seal is open, that is where the trumpets will then be released. And when the seventh trumpet blows, it's when the bowls will start. So the seventh trumpet, or the seventh seal is open. The trumpets will then start pouring out partial judgment. So this will be a third of the population and the remaining earth. So you can see it's still partial, but it's more than a quarter. But then, when the seventh trumpet blows, this is when God will send the angels to pour out His final bowls of wrath, which is the concluding part of the destruction. So this is the final step at this point. This will be full judgment. At that point, no one will be excused from that. So just kind of a picture of what happens and how this goes. So if you're wondering, well, he only did a little bit here and a little bit there, there's reasons why. And I will argue, and I think that there's opportunities in there, and I'm not saying that I'll basically say it like this: we need to do it right now instead of saying, well, I'll just wait to see how bad it really turns out and then I'll figure it out. No, I don't think that's a good idea. Don't take that strategy, because Scripture says that no one turns. And again, I don't know how to interpret that, meaning that I don't know if he's saying literally no one will turn, or none of the people that's described here will. So make that fix now. Just some free advice, right? My wife gets free advice all the time at the house. I'm going to give you guys some free advice. Just go ahead and get that secured right now. Then you don't have to worry about it, okay? Just take that and run with that one. But again, when the seventh seal and trumpet are opened, and the seventh trumpet is blown, there's actually going to be, which is really interesting, there's actually going to be a dramatic pause in heaven. There's actually a moment of pause. It's kind of like, not saying that you've ever been through a hurricane or something, but they say when the eye of the hurricane hits, right, it gets quiet. The sun comes out, and then you've got the back end of the hurricane coming. It's kind of that same idea, is that when the seventh seal is open, there's a dramatic pause in heaven. And when the seventh trumpet is blown, there's a dramatic pause in heaven. And I think what's happening there is that God and the angels are getting geared up for the next round of judgment. So, the judgments are really the most complex elements of this book. When you can really kind of comprehend what the judgments are taking place and what they're saying, they're very complex. And I wanted just to open this up. Any thoughts? I mean, there's not a grand theological answer to this. Is there any thoughts on why it's complicated? Any thoughts about this? I mean, I've got my own opinion. There's not really a right answer or wrong answer, but I just don't know if you ever, these are the things that keep me up late at night, right? I think about these things. I don't know if you do that as well. Next time I'm up, I'll text you at 12:30 and be like, hey, here's what I'm thinking about. Are you awake? But any thoughts why, maybe? That this is a very complicated or confusing. Why doesn't God just come back and just wipe them? Any thoughts?
Give people a chance to repent.
Yeah, to give people an opportunity, right? Absolutely, yeah, and I believe that. I believe that this goes back to when we study the attributes of God. You know, God loves His creation, even the ones that have absolutely slammed Him and disowned Him. You know, Jesus still died for them, and I think He just wants, and that's the type of God that I picture. It's such a loving God that He wants His creation to just open the door, as we talk about opening the door. I think part of it being complicated too. I think a little bit of this, again, to me, there's a lot of Genesis in here. I think it echoes the beginning in chapter 1 of Genesis. There's a lot of confusion about Genesis 1. There's a lot of theories about Genesis 1. And I think there's a lot here too. And I think God puts a little bit of complexity in here to make us think about things, to make us not sure, to kind of keep us on our toes at times. But that's the Chris Cummins commentary. You can do what you want to with that one. So, we'll continue on here. And I wanted to just one more thing about this. What we're going to see with the seals. Again, this is why a lot of people think that maybe we're living in this time right now, is because we're going to see signs of the end, and rather than the end itself. And again, that's why a lot of people are prophesizing we're living in the end times. Remember, we talked about this in Mark chapter 13, specifically around verse 7 of Mark 13. The birth pains, right? We talked about all of these signals and things. This is what's happening here. You know, a lot of people will say that these first 4 seals that are happening right now on earth, these are things that's happening right now, but we fail to understand that these things have been happening since the days of Christ as well. So we say stuff like the end's approaching, right? This is it. So in the tribulation period, but not the great tribulation period again, we have talked about that before. And so we see stuff. We've seen all kinds of false prophets. Obviously, there's death everywhere we look, wars, famines. And again, Matthew outlines this in the Olivet Discourse, or Jesus does in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24. Mark talks about it in chapter 13. Luke I believe is around chapter 21, I think, is where Luke starts talking about this. All of them will tell you the same thing. It's the birth pains, right? It's the birth pains. So this is the process. It's not we're at the end, and this is why I don't think we're at the end stage. But, I mean, we could easily argue that we're in the birth pain stage, right? I mean, there's a lot of things happening. So we'll kind of dive into stuff tonight. So here it is, right? The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. There are movies and songs and poems and books and all kinds of imagery behind these first 4. When this happens, when you see the rider on the whites appear, that's it. All right, here we go. And as we talked about on Wednesday night, there's a lot of people that will slander this. The atheist group had one called the 4 Horsemen of Atheism. So they took this and spun it towards them. But this is a good image of this. And so we get probably the most famous part of Revelation, the 4 Horsemen, and we start off with that. So again, very similar to what Jesus talks about in Olivet Discourse. This is the sermon where Jesus preached the destruction of Jerusalem and His return. It was actually on Tuesday night. So this morning in our sermon, we were on Thursday night. We spent a long time in chapter on day 3 on Wednesday, so this would have been preached on Tuesday afternoon. But it highlights Christ returning and the destruction of Jerusalem, as we talked about in Mark 13. Now, the horsemen are very unique, because when the rest of the seals are open, and the trumpets and even the bowls, there's a very universal theme. But the first 4 seals that is opened by Christ, it brings these 4 people in. It's very different, very unique. And I will tell you when we get into this, the first one, the rider on the white, a lot of controversy on who this one represents, and we'll talk about that in a second. But the first 4 are riders on horses, the angels, the 4 living creatures that are protecting the throne. They have been given the power and the privilege to announce these. So God has said to each one of those 4 creatures, you can announce one of the riders. Different colors are to interpret the meaning of the seals, and they bring destruction to the earth. So it's very contemporary with our time. So we read into this a lot now. Zechariah chapter 1 and Zechariah chapter 6 of the Old Testament pulls a lot of this, or Revelation pulls a lot from there. So, any thoughts, questions before we get started? Everybody good? Everybody ready to hop on a horse and take a ride? No, that's a bad joke. I don't know. Anyway, it's that hour of sleep I'm missing. It's throwing me all off. So let's start, but it's going to be easier if we just do this one rider at a time. So let's start with chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. I watched, and this is John speaking, I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. And then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a white horse, and its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. So, some things about this as we get started. Notice again who opens the seal. This is important. John is talking about the Lamb. Now, again, he says the Lamb. He doesn't say Jesus. And the reason he doesn't say Jesus is because Jesus is not in the form like he was. Remember back to chapter 5. And he looked, he was expecting to see a lion, but he saw a lamb that had been slain, but it wasn't a weak lamb, it was the warrior lamb. It was the magnificent Christ, the Christ that was going to come back as the lion, and that's what he was expecting to see, but instead he saw a lamb. But this wasn't just the normal lamb, right? This was the powerful lamb. This was not Christ on the cross. This is Christ as the returning king. And so he sees that. So he's making reference to this. So it's not Jesus per se. It is Jesus, but it's not what he's thinking Jesus is. So he says, I see the Lamb. The Lamb is worthy to open this. And so he opens the first of the seals. Then I heard the voice of one of the 4 living creatures. So in chapter 4, we were introduced to the 4 angelic beings that had the 4 different faces, that were covered in eyes. So each one of those God has granted permission to announce. And we start with the white horse, the very first one. And so God has given the angels the power to call them down. And this first horse it provides a little bit of mystery. The second, third, and fourth riders and horses are pretty clear-cut. But this one is a little bit tricky to interpret exactly. But a few things that are important here. We see that the bow is mentioned. Bow in the Old Testament reference means power, military authority. This rider that's coming back is the start. So not necessarily that 2, 3, and 4 aren't as strong, but this first one that's coming back is the one that's going to start it all. So they're the conquest, the conquering, the strong, the powerful one. And notice here that he was given a crown. So this is God allowing him to have a crown. This wasn't that he had a crown. And this is an important translation of this. It would read different. It would mean different if God didn't allow him or give him the crown. But it says God gave him a crown. So there's some thoughts. There's some thoughts on this. I'm going to give you 3 of the most common thinkings of what this first horse rider was. And let me just ask you, this is one of the most common ones. When you read this, or if you've read this, or if you've ever kind of thought about this, in your first inclination, who would you say this was? Jesus, right? I mean, you kind of say, well, he's got a crown, he's white, and this is what this first thought is. It could represent Christ and the victory of the gospel, absolutely. And I'm not saying that's wrong. When you go to Revelation chapter 19, at the end of this, especially I think 11 through 16, we're going to see Christ ride in at that moment, white, on a white horse, victorious. So is this the prequel of him right here? So maybe that's what it is. And again, we get this. Read Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse. That will tell you a lot about this. But what's interesting is on this horse, there's no devastation, there's no destruction. Now, he's coming with a bow to start the process of conquering, but he doesn't do anything. So there's one thought, that maybe this is Christ. This is a prequel to Christ. Here's a second thought, that this is God sending or allowing the, capital A, Antichrist to come back. And there's some reasons why. It's a mimic and mocking of Jesus. Now you say, well, that can't be right. That's kind of weird. When we get into the Antichrist, the beast of the earth, and the beast of the sea, how many are those? 3. It's a mocking of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So it's the opposite of that. So there is a lot of thought that maybe that this was the Antichrist. And what happens? God allows him or gives him a crown to wear. If it was Jesus, wouldn't Jesus automatically have a crown on without God giving him this crown to wear? It's just some thoughts. I'm not saying that this is right or wrong either. But if this is the Antichrist coming in, riders 2, 3, and 4 are going to have a very unique and specific purpose. And we will see that when we get into the middle with the beast of the earth and the beast of the sea, because they have very specific jobs. So something to think about with that one. It is supported by the next seal, the 5th seal that will be open. It does kind of support that maybe this was the Antichrist that God has granted the authority to. And that's what's important to understand. Even the Antichrist has to ask God for permission. So don't ever lose sight of that. If this was the Antichrist riding in, God's got to give him the crown and allow him to go in. He has to allow the angel to announce him. So don't lose sight of that. So, but the purpose of that, if it was him, or her, or it, or they, whatever it's going to turn out to be. The purpose with horses 2, 3, and 4 is going to be to destroy the people in the church. There's a true goal there. Now, the third one is that the 4 symbolize something together, like a group of this limited pre-type of judgment. And this results from man's aggressive nature. So we get the rider who's bent on conquest, and so the bow. And so since the beginning of time, right, we see this idea that man has wanted to rule over man, right? I mean, we go back to the Old Testament, and what do we see? Wars, fighting, this idea. And so he was bent on conquest, and so he went out to conquer. So the next 3 horses is going to be the result from the desire, the evil desires of mankind wanting to conquer. So what does he do? He invades. He starts the process of invading. I read it sometimes. I guess it depends on the mood I'm in. On all three of those at times. There's sometimes I feel like, well, maybe that is Christ, even though to me, when I read Revelation 19, I don't feel like it is Christ. I would typically say it's either the second one or this one. This is where I would land. It doesn't affect your salvation either way. You don't have to agree with me on that. That's just kind of where I fall, and I read it as either the second one, that God is allowing the Antichrist to start the process, or that it's just a symbolic preliminary judgment, that man is just evil and aggressive since the beginning, and we see the next three horses kind of follow in. But regardless of which one you think, 1, 2, or 3, the next three horses pretty much fall in line of what they represent. Pretty clear. So let's read verses 3 and 4. So when the Lamb opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, "Come." And then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth, and to make men slay each other. To him was given a large sword. So the natural follow-up here is going to be red. So we're going to get the imagery or the symbol of blood. So it's blood. And we see this at the cross, right? That the blood of Christ washes away, right? We will be presented as white because of the blood of Christ. And so what is the follow to war? If the first rider was bent on conquest and war, what happens when we have war? We have blood, right? We have a loss of life that takes place. And so this is what's happening. And what's important is the color of the horse is important. The riders don't really get a whole lot of description. The last two will get a little bit more, but they don't get a whole lot. It's about the horse. It's about the symbol and the color of the horse. So we get lots of blood from war. And what we see here is that God is absolutely allowing man to destroy man. He's allowing these wars to happen. And so this is where a lot of people will question, and they say stuff to God, or to Christians, and they question God, and they say, if your God was in control, then why doesn't he stop these wars? Well, right here, we understand that God allows these things to take place. He's allowing this. Doesn't mean that God likes it and that God's enjoying it. And absolutely, God has the power to stop it at any point He wants. As a matter of fact, here in a few months, we're going to read where God does stop it. But up to that point, we just have to remember that God is in control. But He's allowing man to destroy man. He's allowing these wars to take place. Zechariah chapter 1, verse 8 and 6:2. This is some good background scripture. And so we see that this rider, which represents war, was given the tool of war, which was the sword. And so he was allowed to have the sword, which was the tool during that time. So then we get to 5 and 6. When the Lamb opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come." And I looked, there before me was a black horse, and its rider, was holding a pair of scales in its hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the 4 living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a day's wage, and 3 quarts of barley for a day's wage, and do not damage the oil and the wine." Now this is different. This is a different passage. So what the black horse is representing here is a couple things. This is poverty and famine. Sometimes you hear this as the scorched earth after a war. This is economics. What's the worry for the world now? The economic crisis, the one world government, like the currency things. People talk about this was the black horse. So this is one of the things that we're seeing, this separation of wealth. That the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, the inflation of prices, and the wages aren't moving, and we're seeing this economic trouble, and people get worried about this. So what they equate that to is this horse. So this is after these wars are over with. We see the economic side of things, and we see a great push of poverty and a great famine that's taking place. And so he makes the angel makes a very interesting comment here, and he says, a quart of wheat for a day's wage and 3 quarts of barley. And so what he's saying is this, that during this time, and this would have been very common language to John and the readers, that basically a quart of wheat, that a quart of wheat could have been purchased and would have lasted for a long time, and you could have purchased that very easily. But what he's saying now, it's going to cost a full day's wage for just 1 quart. So where a person would have had stuff, and the equation to us would be like this, that if all we had to eat was rice, and we could buy a 25-pound sack of rice that would last us all week. Well, now, because of this change, we can only buy enough for one person in one day. So I have to work all day to get just enough rice to eat for that day. Does that make sense? And so that's what the illustration is. And he goes to the barley. And so a family could eat this barley, but the price has shot up so high that it's going to take all of this money to just get enough barley to feed the family for just that one day. And so it's an inflation. It's this idea of inflation. And then, but what's interesting about this is that God places limitations. So God has instructed the angel and put a very strong limitation. It's the first time we've seen God limit something. And he says, so he's telling the writer that when you come to the earth and you start doing this stuff, you can affect part of it, but you can't affect all of it. So you cannot affect the oil. You cannot affect the wine. So God here is once again showing that He is continually on the throne. And so you may have to work all day for just enough for me to eat. Or I'm going to have to work all day to provide just enough food for my family to eat just this one day. But that's all you can touch. You're not allowed to touch anything else. So the oil and the wine. And so it's very interesting that he places a limitation on this. And there's a couple of reasons for that. But I believe it's God just putting the limitations, flexing His muscle, if you will, saying that I am absolutely in control and you cannot wipe everyone out from poverty. Remember, this is just a limited judgment. So it's not going to affect everybody. It's only parts. And so then we get to the last one, and this is a very famous one as well. And this comes from verses 7 and 8. And so when the Lamb opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and there before me was a pale horse, and its rider was named Death, and Hades followed close behind him. And they were given the power over 1/4 of the earth, to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. So here's death. So we typically, when you see the images of this, if you go back and you look at images that people paint of this, we see, the image of what we think of death, the Grim Reaper, right? With the sickle. He doesn't have a sickle there, though, does he? And there's the scales for the economic thing. But we get this idea. And so, let me get back to where we're at. And so the pale horse, death, and says that death is followed by Hades. Now, it doesn't say if Hades is riding on a horse or if Hades follows by foot, which is kind of interesting. But Hades represents the abode or the place of the dead. And we talked a little bit about this a couple weeks ago. And so remember, 2 points on this. First is that, remember when the Jews say heavens, the plural of heavens, remember what their thinking was, that there's 3 levels. There is Sheol, which is this, the abode of the dead. There is earth, where we're at now. And then there is heaven, which John represents when he says we're in the presence of God in heaven. So heavens has 3 levels. So what he's saying here is that death followed, and the Hades, from the depths of the earth in the Jewish tradition and Jewish thinking. So all the Old Testament people, when they would die, they would go to Sheol. They would go down, literally down in the earth. They believed it was in the earth. This is almost a Catholic type of belief. But they would go down inside the earth, and that God would raise them up when it was time for them to be raised up. And so he says that, so Hades, the abode of the dead, the death was over this Sheol, this place, was coming through. And it's really, and Sheol is very interesting to read about because the Old Testament talks about Sheol quite a bit. But the power of death, and so as the 4th rider is coming in, and we've seen the first one come out that has said there's going to be conquering, there's going to be conflict, there's going to be war. The second one comes out and shows all the bloodshed. The 3rd horse comes that shows the aftermath, the famine and the poverty and the struggles of people after war. And then we see the 4th one show up, and he's going to start the process of allowing or killing 1/4 of the people by the sword, by famine, really by the first 3. Whatever's happened with the first 3, he's kind of putting that or pushing that to go. Even gets so graphic that he says even the wild beasts on the earth, they will eat corpses. The ones that are wounded, the wild beasts will come through and take those out. And so it's a very, very intense opening scene. It's a very scary opening scene. And, we've talked about this before as these literal events. And it depends on how you interpret Revelation and how you want to see these things. Again, there's some people that will say we're living in this right now. And so that, remember the Jehovah's Witnesses said this took place all in 1914. Well, it almost makes sense. I'm not going to give them credit, but it kind of makes sense though, doesn't it? Because again, what was happening in 1914? The First Great World War. We saw death. We saw what follows that. We see the Great Depression. We see a lot of things, and it would be easy for us to say, well, we go right to that. But there had been a lot of history before that where we've had bad things happen. And there's going to be a lot of things that are going to continue to take place. And this is why I don't think we're actually living in this final stage yet. I'm not saying that we're not close. My interpretation and my belief is that I think when John says that he sees this happening, when he sees a horse, I read this as a very literal interpretation. I think when an angel is going to speak, we're going to know it. I think when trumpets sound, we won't be around hopefully when the trumpets sound, but when we see these creatures coming out, when God says it's time to start the process, I think we're going to see that very clear. And again, this is just me, my interpretation. If we think we have it bad now, wait until God says, go. It's going to get bumpy. And this is why we have to stress the hope of Jesus Christ. And that's what, when I read Revelation, that's what comes to mind for me. That's what excites me. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that in the sense of that I'm so thankful that I know Jesus Christ. I'm so thankful. And that it does excite me because I know this is going to get very bumpy. And I'm excited for Christ to reach down and pick me up and get me out of here when this stuff happens, because I really don't want to be around for this, because it's going to be sad. And I want my eyes to be focused on God. That's who I want to look at. And so, again, the urgency. And so what we're going to kind of see here is a very logical sequence that takes place. The military general is going to lead the charge. War is going to follow. Famine is going to follow that. And we know once war and famine take over, people are going to die. But it's only a quarter of the people. That's important to know. And that's what's kind of scary. Because if that's taking place on a quarter of the people, when we start getting into the thirds, God's going to start squeezing a little bit more. And then when we get to his bowls, there's no hiding at that point. There's no repenting. So we really need to stress that. a little bit. So we'll go ahead and stop there for today. It timed out just about right. We got a few minutes left to kill. So let me get your